Be me, senior creative director at a mid-size marketing agency in Chicago. Been there 8 years, started as a junior copywriter. Worked my way up the old-fashioned way, the kind of place where people actually liked coming to work, not in some fake corporate we're a family way. Just genuinely decent environment, around 40 people total. Good mix of ages and backgrounds. Agency had been around for 12 years. When this all started, solid reputation, loyal clients. Nothing flashy, but everything functional. We did good work, clients paid, people got their bonuses. At the end of the year, my job was mostly overseeing creative output, managing the bigger accounts, running pitches. I knew every major client personally, knew their business, their market, what kept them up at night, what made them sign off without requesting 15 rounds of revisions. That kind of relationship takes years to build, and most people in this industry know that. Had a solid account manager working alongside me, best closer I've seen in this industry, genuinely could read a room in 30 seconds, and by the end of the meeting, the client was already mentally spending the budget together. We were basically the engine that kept the agency moving forward. Rest of the team was good too. A lot of talented people, project managers who actually managed things, copywriters who could write, designers who could design, and didn't spend half the day asking for validation. The kind of team where if you had a problem, you just went and talked to someone and they helped you. No politics, no strange dynamics. Just work. CEO was a decent guy, bit passive, but he trusted people and mostly stayed out of the way. That part mattered more than I realized at the time. Everything was running fine for years. Then the agency decided it needed an HR director. We'd been operating with a part-time HR consultant for years. Nothing major ever happened that required more than that. But the company was growing a little, and I guess it made sense on paper to bring someone on full-time. CEO posted the position, interviewed some candidates, made a choice. None of us were involved in the hiring process in any real way. First time most of us met her was at the all-hands meeting where she was introduced, mid-30s, very put together, confident in the way people are when they know exactly what they're going to say, before you even ask the question. She gave a little speech about her background, her vision, how she was passionate about building healthy workplace cultures. Everyone clapped politely. I remember thinking she seemed sharp and probably a bit intense, but that was fine. HR people are supposed to be a little intense. It comes with the territory. Nobody thought much of it. After that, she spent her first couple of months mostly doing onboarding type things, reviewing existing policies, talking to people one-on-one, pretty quiet overall. Kept to herself. Occasionally you'd see her taking detailed notes in meetings, but she never said anything disruptive. I figured she was just getting the lay of the land, which is what most reasonable new hires do. Around the end of her second month, things started to shift, subtle at first, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. She started sending emails with a different tone, not aggressive exactly, but loaded with a specific kind of language. Words like psychological safety and inclusive environment and culture audit, the kind of language that sounds perfectly reasonable until you realize it's being used to describe a problem that nobody in the building had actually identified. Nobody had complained about anything. Nobody had come to me or the CEO with concerns. The last employee satisfaction survey we'd done had been genuinely positive, but apparently we had a problem and she had come to fix it. First real move was the all-staff email announcing something called the Zero Testosterone Workplace Initiative. I read it twice because I thought I was misunderstanding the title. The email was about 3 paragraphs of corporate wellness. The actual content was vague, but there was an attachment with a link to a mandatory webinar, Friday at 5 in the afternoon, so already off to a great start. Everyone showed up because it was mandatory, and also because nobody knew what this was. And the title was strange enough to make people curious. She presented a slideshow. The core argument, as far as I could follow it, was that the agency's culture contained patterns of testosterone-driven behavior that were creating harm. She had a list of examples. Competitive language, direct communication styles, urgency around deadlines, celebrating individual wins, using phrases like killing it or crushing the competition. All of this was presented as evidence of a toxic environment. One of the senior designers asked what specific incidents had led to this analysis. She said the initiative wasn't based on incidents, it was based on structural patterns. Another person asked if there had been complaints from anyone on the team. She said the absence of formal complaints didn't mean there was no harm. It meant people didn't feel safe enough to complain. So the evidence for the problem was the lack of evidence for the problem. I should have understood right then what kind of logic we were operating under, but I figured it was an introductory presentation, and the actual policies that followed would be grounded in something more concrete. First, real policy. Came the following week, she sent out an official memo stating that the word deadline was no longer acceptable in workplace communication. Effective immediately, the replacement term was intention window. Anyone using the word deadline in emails, meetings, or any internal communication would receive a written warning on first offense. I genuinely sat at my desk and reread this email 4 times, sent her a direct reply, asking if this was a finalized policy or a draft circulated for feedback. She replied within 10 minutes, saying that the reaction I was having was exactly the kind of resistance the initiative was designed to surface and address. That was the first time I felt something cold settle into the back of my mind. Not anger exactly, more like the feeling you get when you realize the situation you're in is fundamentally different from what you assumed it was. Deadline was now intention window. I started using the new term in client emails just to see what would happen in practice. One client replied to an email about their campaign schedule asking if I meant deadline. I said yes. He said, okay, just checking. Thought it was a typo. Nobody outside the building knew what an intention window was, and there was no universe in which they were going to start using the term. But internally, the word was banned. So every time a client used the word deadline in correspondence, we had to mentally translate before responding. Over the next week or so, she had things installed and posted around the office, posters on the walls, in the common areas, and near the kitchen. One said, "This is a testosterone-free zone," in large friendly letters. Another said, "Your urgency is not my emergency." A third was a graphic about emotional labor that was several paragraphs long and positioned near the coffee machine where nobody was going to read it. Carefully, the conference rooms all got new names. The main meeting room had been called the War Room since the agency opened, just an informal name. Nobody thought about it. It became the Harmony Space. The smaller room got named Lotus. The corner room where we usually did client calls became Clarity or Serenity. I genuinely cannot remember which one. I showed up to a client meeting one morning and spent about 3 minutes walking around the floor trying to find the room because my brain kept going to the old name client was already on the call. When I finally connected, told them I'd had a technical issue with the conference line. The week after that, she introduced the Feeling Circle mandatory morning meeting. 30 minutes, every weekday. Not a stand-up, not a project check-in, not anything related to work at all. An emotional check-in where each person was supposed to share how they were feeling that morning, not professionally, not about current projects. Emotionally, the format was that you sat in a circle and went around, one by one. First session was awkward in the way. Things are awkward when adults are asked to do something designed for elementary school counseling. My guy went somewhere in the middle of the rotation, said something like, "Feeling good, had a decent weekend, can we move to the project updates?" She stopped him and asked him to go deeper into his emotional state. He said that was about as deep as he had. At 8:30 in the morning, she wrote something in her notebook. We found out much later that she was keeping individual notes on each person's emotional engagement and resistance levels. During the circles, his entry from that day apparently described him as emotionally unavailable and resistant to vulnerability. Protocols only found out about the notes later when everything had already come apart. The inclusion checklist arrived the week after the Feeling Circles, a 47-point document that every piece of creative work had to pass through before it could be shared externally with any client. 47 individual items, some examples from the list, because this is genuinely what we were working with. One item asked whether the visual content contained images of dominance. Another asked whether color choices avoided gendered associations. There was an item about whether the overall tone could be interpreted as assertive in a way that centers masculine energy. One item asked whether any language in the copy used competitive framing. Another asked whether any human figures depicted showed poses suggesting authority or control. The final item on the list was whether the material had passed an internal empathy audit. The empathy audit was not defined anywhere in the document. When I asked in a reply email what the empathy audit process looked like, she said it would be assessed on a case-by-case basis. According to contextual sensitivity, a pitch that used to go from brief to client in one solid working day now took a minimum of a week, sometimes considerably longer, when multiple checklist items got flagged and the work had to go back. For revisions, clients started noticing the turnaround times, slipping a couple, asked what was going on with the pace. I told them we were updating our internal review process, which was accurate, just left out. The specifics next thing she brought to the CEO was the bonus structure for years. The agency had run a straightforward performance bonus for account managers, tied to new contracts. They brought in simple, clean system. Everyone understood it. It worked well. My guy in particular had built a good portion of his income around those bonuses because he was consistently the top performer. She presented the CEO with an argument that the competitive bonus structure was reinforcing toxic individualism and creating a winner-loser dynamic that undermined collective well-being. CEO asked if there had been complaints from the team about the bonus system. She said absence of complaints indicated that people didn't feel psychologically safe enough to voice concerns. Same argument she'd used for everything else. CEO approved, phasing it out to this day. I don't fully understand why he kept agreeing to things without pushing back. My best guess is he thought he was being responsible and didn't want to be the person who dismissed the HR director when she talked about workplace safety. Also possible, he wasn't reading the details carefully enough to understand the cumulative effect. My guy went directly to the CEO after hearing about the bonus decision, laid out very calmly and specifically that removing performance-based compensation without replacing it with equivalent base pay was functionally a pay cut. CEO said he appreciated the feedback and encouraged him to stay open to the new direction. That phrase became something of a grim joke between us. Stay open to the new direction. The direction the agency was heading in was pretty clear by this point, and nobody was particularly excited about it, but nothing had crossed the line that made leaving feel necessary. Yet the feeling circles were annoying, the checklist was slowing things down, the renamed rooms were a minor daily irritation. People were frustrated, but they still had jobs, and the work was still getting done. Just slower that changed when she filed a formal complaint against me directly to the CEO. 3 pages, formally documented. The core claim was that my behavior during presentations and client meetings created an unsafe environment for women. On the team, specifically, she characterized my communication style as dominating and said my confidence levels were disproportionate in a way that made others feel unable to contribute. I asked to see the specific complaints from team members that were referenced in the document. She said they were anonymous and protected under confidentiality. Protocols, I asked for any specific example, any single incident, any concrete description of something I had done or said. She told me that demanding evidence rather than engaging with the feedback in good faith was itself a demonstration of the problematic pattern she was describing. I asked the CEO what the standard process was for responding formally to a complaint of this nature. He told me the required response was completion of a mandatory 3-day empathy and allyship training program, off-site location, conducted on my own time, paid for out of my own pocket. I sat across from him for a moment after he finished explaining that not angry, just unusually clear-headed 8 years at that agency, brought in clients that made up a substantial portion of annual revenue, stayed late without being asked when a pitch needed to get done, took client calls on weekends. When something came up, came in sick more than once because the work had to move, and the resolution to 3 pages of anonymous allegations with no specific incidents was for me to spend 3 days and my own money attending a seminar. I stood up, thanked him for his time, walked back to my desk, wrote a short resignation letter, went back to his office, placed it on the desk, said it had been a good 8 years, cleared my personal things from my workspace. The same afternoon, didn't send a farewell email to the team, didn't make a speech, said goodbye to a couple of people I was close to, and walked out. Found out later that evening, the CEO tried calling me, didn't answer. She sent me an email 2 days after I left, said my departure was a demonstration of the discomfort that comes with genuine cultural growth, and that she hoped I would eventually find the space to reflect on the experience. Didn't reply to that. Either my guy lasted roughly another month after I left. The specific breaking point for him was almost too absurd to believe. He closed a significant contract, one of the better new business wins the agency had seen. That quarter came into the feeling circle the following morning in a genuinely good mood, said he was feeling great, mentioned he'd closed the deal. She stopped him mid-sentence and told the group that expressing joy in the context of winning something was a form of competitive aggression, said he should take some time to explore why success made him feel the need to signal dominance to his colleagues. He looked at her for several seconds without saying anything, stood up, walked out of the circle, and back to his desk. Had his resignation drafted and on the CEO's desk. Before noon, she called an all-team meeting that afternoon, told everyone the agency was going through a painful but necessary purification process. Said the resistance from certain individuals was confirmation that the cultural work was hitting its target, that the discomfort was a sign things were changing. Some people in the room applauded. Megan was one of them, enthusiastically. Megan was a junior account manager who'd been at the agency maybe a year and a half at that point. Smart, motivated, genuinely good at her job when the environment let her do it. She'd bought into the whole initiative from the beginning, the language, the framework, the feelings circles, the general worldview behind all of it, which I understood in a way. She was young, she wanted to belong, and the culture being promoted explicitly centered and validated her perspective. Plenty of people align with things for social reasons, especially early in their careers. She figured it out eventually, the hard way. Because without me and my guy around to carry the major accounts, the gaps became impossible to ignore. She had been quietly hiring replacements for months, building a team aligned with the initiative. Several of the new hires had backgrounds in communications, cultural consulting, or nonprofit work focused on equity and inclusion. Enthusiastic people used the right language, clearly believed in the mission. None of them had ever managed a marketing account for a real client. With a real budget and a real quarterly target, the first major client to leave was one I'd personally managed for 5 years. They called in asking for their new point of contact, got connected with one of the new hires. She sent them a revised pitch deck. A couple of weeks later, entirely neutral color palette. Every visual element softened or rounded. Every piece of copy run through the checklist multiple times. The messaging was so carefully inoffensive that it communicated almost nothing. Client sent back a polite acknowledgement email. 3 days later, they sent a formal notice ending the contract, citing strategic misalignment. Second major client had a product launch coming up that needed aggressive, competitive market positioning. They were entering a crowded space against established players, and soft messaging was not going to move the needle. The new team kept flagging their briefs at multiple points in the inclusion checklist. Their logo had been flagged for angular geometry, suggesting masculine assertiveness. The campaign concept used the phrase "dominate the market" in reference to their business goals. The color red appeared in their brand standards and was flagged as emotionally aggressive. Every version of the work that came back had been softened to the point where it no longer reflected what the client was trying to accomplish. The client requested a call to discuss the work. She joined the call without being asked, started the meeting by asking everyone present to share their pronouns and their current emotional state as part of the new meeting format. The client was a man in his early 60s who'd been running a family business for 3 decades. He said he wasn't sure he understood the question. She explained the intention and the reasoning. He said he'd come to discuss his upcoming campaign. She said this was a standard part of the new process, and everyone found it helpful. Once they tried it, he thanked everyone for their time and disconnected from the call. Contract cancellation came in. Writing a few days later, over the following months, the pattern kept repeating with minor variations. Intention windows kept slipping because nobody had the depth of experience needed to run multiple complex accounts. Simultaneously, clients calling for updates would get responses written according to the template she'd drafted: 2 paragraphs about the agency being in a period of cultural transformation and enhanced process refinement. 1 paragraph about their commitment to producing elevated quality work. Going forward, clients weren't interested in reading about cultural transformation. They wanted their campaigns delivered on schedule and to the standard they were paying for. One client apparently replied to the template response, asking what any of that had to do with their social media calendar being 3 weeks past. The agreed date got a second template response. Megan was handling the sharpest edge of this. She'd been given an account to manage independently after I left. Mid-size retail, client, well-established relationship. Not the most complex account in the world, but she couldn't get anything through the internal review process at a reasonable pace, kept hitting the checklist at different points. Each time she submitted work, The client's established branding used a particular shade of blue that got flagged as associated with authoritative masculinity. Megan explained to the reviewer that this was the client's brand color. It appeared on all their existing materials, and she had no authority to change. It was told that the agency had an opportunity to help guide clients toward more inclusive visual communication. Megan called the client and very carefully and diplomatically tried to raise the possibility of exploring some evolution in their visual identity. Client asked directly if she was suggesting they needed a rebrand. Megan said, "Not exactly." More of an exploration. Client said they'd been working with the agency for 3 years without this conversation coming up, and asked what had changed. Megan didn't have an answer that would have made sense to anyone outside the building. Client didn't pull the contract immediately, but the warmth went out of the relationship. After that call, the aggression audit launched around the same time, monthly anonymous form sent to all staff. Each person rated their colleagues across a range of categories, designed to measure testosterone toxicity. The categories included things like frequency of interrupting, volume of speaking voice, tendency to disagree openly in meetings, pace of communication, and comfort with extended silence. Results were reviewed by her and used to inform one-on-one conversations about behavioral adjustment. Nobody knew exactly who had flagged what, because the submissions were anonymous. So you'd get called into a private meeting and told that colleagues had noted elevated aggression patterns in your communication style, and you couldn't ask who said it, couldn't ask when it happened, couldn't ask for a specific example, just had to sit there and absorb it and commit to behavioral changes that were never clearly defined. One of the designers, guy who'd been with the agency for 6 years, got pulled in and told his habit of drumming his fingers on the table during meetings had been flagged as physically assertive behavior. He told me about it later, and we both just stared at each other for a moment. Finger drumming. He stopped doing it, started sitting with his hands flat on the table, looked vaguely uncomfortable in every meeting after that. Another person got flagged for laughing too loudly. Not inappropriate laughter, just volume. The feedback was that high-volume positive reactions could be perceived as a form of social dominance she had apparently written in that person's file that they needed to work on, regulating the intensity of their emotional expression in shared spaces. The office atmosphere changed in a specific and noticeable way. Almost immediately, people started talking less, not because they were content and focused, but because nobody wanted to say something that ended up in their audit file. Any display of enthusiasm during a meeting became a potential liability. Pushing back on an idea, even constructively, meant risking a report about your tendency to disagree publicly. Expressing frustration about a deadline that had slipped was demonstrating aggression patterns. The safest behavior was to say very little and agree with everything that was said, which is what most people started doing. Real creative disagreement, the kind that actually makes the work better over time, essentially people stopped fighting for their ideas, because fighting for your ideas was now categorized as dominating behavior. One of the copywriters told me much later that she used to love the internal creative reviews because people would argue about ideas and it made the work better. Said that after the audit system went in, those reviews became 30-minute sessions where everyone nodded at everything and nothing improved. She said she started feeling like she was working inside a library where the books were slowly being removed one at a time. The work suffered in a direct and measurable way, not because the individuals were less capable, but because the environment had made honest feedback something to avoid rather than something to seek out. She continued to frame all of it in team meetings as evidence of genuine progress, talked about the culture, healing, the team coming into alignment, the fresh energy the new hires were bringing. The client roster and revenue figures were not consistent with this reading of events somewhere in the 4th or 5th month after I left. Megan started keeping a list. She told me this much later. She wasn't trying to build a case or prove anything. She was just trying to make sense of what she was watching happen around her client losses with dates and the reasons given or implied in the surrounding communication. When she spread it out on paper, the picture was about as clear as it could be. 7 clients gone in roughly 3 months. Every single departure had a direct connection to some aspect of the new policies. Checklist delays blocking work from reaching the client on time. Meeting format, changes alienating clients on calls, quality concerns from clients who noticed the work had changed. relationship breakdowns, after conversations about brand evolution that clients hadn't asked for. Megan had been there long enough to know what the baseline looked like. One client relationship had ended in the 2 years before the initiative launched, 7 and 3 months after it began. She brought the list to her, quietly, no confrontation, just the numbers presented as a concern. She wanted to raise what she got back was an explanation that the data was a reflection of toxic legacy structures those clients had grown comfortable with under the previous culture, that the agency was now attracting and retaining better clients, more aligned clients, clients who would appreciate the authentic approach, and that Megan's anxiety about the numbers suggested she might benefit from some internal decolonization work. To address her attachment to old metrics, Megan left that conversation and opened her resume file for the first time in 2 years. She told me later that sitting across from her and listening to that explanation, something just went quiet inside her. Not dramatic, no anger, just a clear and simple recognition. The quarterly report landed and the CEO read it carefully. This time revenue down 61% against the same quarter from the previous year. 3 major contracts formally terminated with written explanations, all citing quality and reliability concerns. One cancellation letter specifically referenced a decline in service quality following personnel changes at the agency. He called her into his office. She came with a folder. The folder apparently contained printouts of articles about masculine toxicity in creative industry environments, a piece from a wellness publication about healing organizational trauma, and a 2-page proposal for a new position called Chief Empathy Officer. He placed the quarterly report on the desk, between them. She started explaining that the numbers were the result of deliberate sabotage. I had structured client dependencies to make myself irreplaceable. My guy had been running a culture of intimidation, that clients were finally free to escape from the new hires needed more time to demonstrate their full capacity. The real results of the transformation would emerge over the next year or two. CEO opened his laptop, went through the internal correspondence chronologically and methodically, showed her the 3 formal complaints she had filed against me. In the 2 weeks directly preceding my resignation, showed her the email chain in which she recommended eliminating the performance bonus system, showed her a timeline of every policy she had introduced, alongside a corresponding timeline of every client relationship that had deteriorated in the same period. The correlation was exact in nearly every case, showed her the hiring decisions she had made and the output those hires had produced over the preceding months. She said it was a selectively assembled reading of the evidence designed to support a predetermined conclusion. CEO said he had a meeting with legal counsel scheduled for later that week and suggested she return her building access badge before the end of the day. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, just a man who had finally looked at the numbers and a woman who had run out of explanations that fit them. She was gone before the end of the week, found out through someone still there that she put a post up on LinkedIn not long after something about being released from her position as an act of systemic retaliation by patriarchal leadership that feared genuine transformation, described herself as a cultural changemaker, targeted for challenging entrenched power structures, said she was open to work at organizations, brave enough to prioritize people over profit margins. The post got 11 likes total. Most of them were friends from outside the industry or contacts from a previous job. A handful of accounts with no profile photos. Nobody from the agency engaged with it. Megan didn't like or comment. One of the remaining employees apparently showed the post around the office. People read it and went back to their desks without saying much. There wasn't much to say. At that point, the building had already said everything I heard about the post, secondhand through someone I still talked to. From the old place, didn't look it up, didn't feel the need. By the time that post went up, I'd already been building something else. My guy had come to me, not long after he walked out of that last feelings circle. We'd talked in passing over the years about eventually going independent, the way most people in creative work do when they're comfortable somewhere. Suddenly we were both available and neither of us had anything holding us back. Started small and deliberately, the two of us. A couple of experienced freelancers we trusted, a modest office space. Nothing fancy, called it Axis, no mission statement about transformation. No policy documents about cultural initiatives. No special names for the rooms, just a space where people could do. The work deadlines were called deadlines when someone closed a deal. Everyone was happy about it and said, so, if someone's idea wasn't working, we said that clearly, and moved on to finding something that did. 2 of my former clients reached out within the first month. They'd kept old contact information and tracked me down. Neither of them asked about what had happened at the previous agency. They just asked if I was in a position to work with them. We signed both of them inside the first 6 weeks. Megan left the agency a few months after the HR director was fired. The agency had tried to pull itself back together, but the structural damage was significant, and a lot of the institutional knowledge had walked out the door. She reached out to me eventually, asked if we had capacity for anyone with her background. We brought her on. When the timing worked out, she was good at her job, had always been good at her job. The feeling circle applause never really came up between us. She was in her mid-20s, working her first real agency job, and the person in charge of the culture was telling her she was on the right side of something important. It's not hard to understand how that works on someone who's still figuring out where they stand. The initiative spoke directly to things she'd been told her whole life mattered: safety, inclusion, belonging, making sure the environment worked for everyone. All of that sounds good on paper, and most of it is good in principle. The execution is a different conversation entirely. What she figured out on her own through a list of numbers on a piece of paper is something a lot of people never get to: the difference between a workplace that values people and a workplace that performs valuing people, while systematically preventing anyone from doing anything useful. I spent 8 years building client relationships, creative standards, and professional reputation at that agency. Nearly lost most of it because of a 3-page anonymous complaint with no named sources and no specific incidents. The work we're doing at Axis now is some of the best I've been part of. No inclusion checklist, no morning emotional inventory, no testosterone-free zone placards, no intention windows, just people who know their work, doing it, and getting paid fairly for the results. Apparently that's a radical concept. In some circles, LBW intention window